Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the research session. We're going to have this every Fridays from now on for the rest of the semester. So my name is Gautam Das. I'm the Associate Dean for Research for the College of Engineering. So I basically provide strategic and vision to the research innovations and research agenda of the university and make sure that it's aligned with the strategic vision of research for the entire university and the college. I also assist in making sure that faculty members get the right resources to do the research well. I do a lot of team formation, team building. Anyway, that's enough about me, and I'll be the host for all these Friday meetings from now on for the rest of the semester. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Assistant Professor Dr. Carolyn Krejci. I hope I got your name right, your last name. It's a tricky one. She is assistant professor in industrial engineering in the College of Engineering at UTA. She has been here, I guess, for a couple of years, and she used to be at Iowa State University prior to that for a few years, and I believe she graduated from University of Washington up in Seattle. So I was there in Seattle myself for a few years, probably before your time. So I'd like to welcome her to give her presentation, and she's going to introduce herself a little bit and tell us what she's going to talk about. So the way it's going to work is, once she's done with her presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, and all participants, if you look at your screen, you will get to see an option to open up a chat box. I think if you look at there are two quotation sort of clouds, that kind of a symbol there. So if you click on that, that will open up a chat box, and if you can start typing in your questions at any time, we'll make sure that they get published. If you have any issues, just let me know, and we'll try to help you. Carolyn, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction. So I'm Carolyn Krejci, and I've been faculty here at UTA in the Industrial Engineering Department for 3 years now. And as Dr. Das mentioned, I was previously faculty at Iowa State University, and before that I got my PhD at University of Washington. And actually before that I was in industry for a while. I worked as an operations engineer for Lutron Electronics, and I also worked for a short time at UPS as an industrial engineer. And so my interest has always been sort of on the supply chain and logistics side of industrial engineering. And that's where most of my research is focused right now. And so that kind of leads into my talk pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation here. Sorry, there we go. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see that title slide. So the title of my talk today, so I'm talking about a research project that we've been working on for the past year, but really this project has been, this is a follow-on from some research that I've been working on for the past 6 years. So the title of the talk is Designing Logistics Systems for More Efficient Food Delivery for Texas Farmers and Ranchers. So it is a Texas-based research project, very excited about it. So we'll just jump right into that. So a little bit of background and motivation for this project. Our food supply system, the food supply system that we rely on in the US, actually faces a number of challenges. And I think that it's safe to say that before the COVID-19 emergency, most people in the US probably did not realize that our food supply system was as fragile as it actually is, and that it faced the challenges that it does. And that's not too big of a surprise, because before I got into this area of research, before I knew much about our food supply chain, probably like many people, if I needed food, if my family needed food, go to the grocery store. I have a number of options of places to go for food, right? You go to Costco or HEB or Kroger or wherever, many options. Pretty much anything I needed was there. Many options for food, good quality, generally very safe, range of prices. So, there wasn't really a problem, and it was always that way. It's fairly convenient and very reliable. So I think that a lot of people in the US may not think very much about their food supply system, and that's probably in some ways is a good thing, right? However, the recent COVID-19 emergency has, I think, brought to the forefront some of the issues that our food supply chain actually faces. And so I'll talk about some of those right now. So actually, hopefully this is not the case for anybody in this audience, but unfortunately many consumers actually are not able to access fresh and healthy food, and usually that is because of poverty. And so unfortunately, the DFW area, so Dallas County and Tarrant County, are in the top 10 counties in the US for food insecurity, for food insecure households. So that's not a good thing at all. Food insecurity is a major problem. Since the pandemic started, it's been even more severe. So that's a huge issue. Even though we produce and we have access to lots and lots of food in the US, many people unfortunately are not able to afford it. On the other side of that, our food supply system is plagued by food waste, and you may have heard about this, but it's a rough estimate is about a third of our food supply is wasted at some point along the supply chain for a variety of reasons. So there's all this waste, and yet there's all this need. Okay, so that's also a challenge. Another thing that you may have some awareness of is that we in the US are typically reliant on distant food sources, okay? And so much of our fresh food comes from California, from Mexico, sometimes even from further than that. So for example, apples from New Zealand, grapes from Chile, all over the world our food comes from. And what's the problem with that? Well, often it doesn't seem that there's much of a problem. From the environmental sustainability side of things, there's issues with that because all of that transport relies on fossil fuel consumption. So you have the consumption of a non-renewable resource, you have greenhouse gas emissions, and then also you have the quality issues alongside of that. If you have your food trucked from California, you may not have, necessarily really bad quality issues. You are going to have some food wastage, but often the food will be, not as fresh as you might like. So there's those issues. And then on another piece of that, relying on distant food sources, is a lack of accountability. And by that, I mean that if you have food producers that are very distant from you, you don't know what they're doing, okay? So you don't know what they're spraying on the food. You don't know how the animals are being treated. You don't know how the labor that is harvesting and growing that food is being treated. So if you don't know that, then, producers can get away with all kinds of things that are not good for the environment and are not good for people. So that's some issues with our supply chain relying on distant food sources, which is predominant. And then this last aspect is something that has come to the forefront with the COVID-19 emergency, and I think that probably many people became aware of this at that point. Is that our food supply system relies on centralized production, and so that means that there's a lot of large-scale producers, and I shouldn't say a lot of them, there are relatively few large-scale producers, and we're relying on those producers for the bulk of our food supply. And then I said lean supply chains, and so what that means in a nutshell is that there's not a lot of inventory, and so there's not much buffer if there's some kind of issue that comes up, like a pandemic. So there's not a lot of room for error. Okay, so the reason that we have it set up that way, the reason the supply chain is set up that way, is because it's very cost efficient. Okay, and in general, that's really good for us because that means that we pay less at the store. But in the larger picture of things, that's not necessarily good. It can be, and it has been actually very damaging to rural economies. So if you have your food supply very centralized, very large scale farms, then what happens to the small scale farms? They can't compete, they go out of business. And that's been very, very tough on rural economies. And then the last point there is that they are very vulnerable to disruptions. And so that's what we've seen over the last 6 months with COVID is massive disruptions to our food supply chain. And we're for the most part back on track now. But for a while there, you can see on the pictures there on the right hand side of the slide. So those come from a New York Times article that came out looking at some of these issues. So what you see there is some green beans that a farmer was growing for consumption being disked into the soil as mulch. Okay, so they're not going to go to consumers. And then at the bottom is a large pit of onions. And so those onions are not going to consumers either. They're going to be buried also to rot, basically. So that all that food wasted. And the reason is that with COVID, all the supply chains were disrupted. So there were no restaurants, no institutions. None of those organizations were open and buying food. And so the farmers were set up to send their food to those demand centers. And when they're not there, then what do you do with it? And in the meantime, you know, if you went to the store at the time that COVID was really, you know, in April, we were running out of food. There were empty shelves, meat shortages, all kinds of terrible things. And so it just was this big mess, right? The farmers can't, you know, they were set up to send their product for institutional sales. And then what it turned out we needed was more food in retail chains. And so that's how our food system is set up. So what do we do about it? So one alternative, and I shouldn't actually say alternative, I should maybe say supplement, because I'm not necessarily saying our current food system needs to just go out the window entirely. I think there's some good things about it, frankly. But as another alternative, I think it's wise to consider regional food supply systems. And so what are those? If you've ever purchased food at a farmer's market, you know what a regional food supply system is. You may have heard of it termed as local food as well. So it's food that is grown, is produced close to the consumer. Okay, and so a regional food supply system is characterized by, rather than really a few really large mega farms and mega slaughterhouses and dairies, by small and medium scale, often diversified farms. Okay, so there's a lot of good things about that. Not only are we spreading out risk and spreading out production over a large number of producers, rather than having it all centralized and therefore you know, a little bit at risk to disruptions, but there's also all the other good things that go with that. There's accountability to the producers. So if you know your producer, or if your grocery store knows your producer, then it's less likely that they're going to do things that are you don't agree with, that you don't value. All of those good things. You're reducing the distance, and so your transport distance is less. Fresher food, all kinds of advantages. So why don't we just do that? And actually, in the you know, in April and May, regionalized food production, you may have seen in the news, actually went through the roof. People that weren't able to find the food they wanted at their typical grocery store, or who were nervous about going to the grocery store, were going to farmers markets, or they were getting food delivered from local farmers. And so it's a great thing, so why not just do more of it, right? So there's a lot of reasons why not. There's a lot of challenges that regional food supply systems face, and the one that I'm most interested in, and the one that I think is possibly one of the biggest challenges, is transportation and distribution. So if you have a regionalized food production system, that's great. It's very decentralized, like I said, many advantages, but you have all these small and medium scale farms all over the place, and they're typically rurally located, and yet your demand centers are urban. And so then the question is how do we get all these small volumes of food from small scale farms, from scattered all over the place, to our big demand centers? So if you've got farmers all over central Texas and your demand center is Austin and San Antonio, how do you get the food there? So it's actually really hard. It's not cost effective for farmers to do variety of issues. Mainly that they don't have the infrastructure. Okay, so they don't have the skills. They're farmers. They're good at farming. They don't necessarily have good transportation and distribution skills. They may not have the appropriate vehicles. They don't have the time, they don't have the labor to get the food to market. And then you might say, well, why not just hire someone else to do that? You know, just order a truck to come pick it up. Well, that's expensive. And then it gets into scheduling and into volumes, lots of challenges. So our research is how can we look at existing logistics best practices, and so I'm thinking, you know, companies that we all know that do logistics really well, like UPS or Walmart or some, you know, some of these famous companies that are doing logistics very well for conventional systems, and use those ideas to make regional food supply more efficient and more effective. And so this particular project that I'm working on with a team of students and also with some collaborators out from Central Texas the title of the project is Regional Food Transportation for Texas Farmers. It's funded by a sustainable agriculture branch of the USDA. And so what we're seeking to do is to design a regional transportation system that supports small-scale Texas farmers. And to help them get their food to market in a more efficient way. The idea with this is we want the system that we design to be stakeholder driven. And by that I mean that we want to make sure that the people that are going to be using this system, that are going to rely on this system, so the farmers certainly, and then also the recipients of the food, that it's what they actually need. So we don't want to come in here as you know, university engineering researchers and say, hey, farmers, we know exactly what you need. We've been researching this for a long time and we're going to design this system and it's going to change your lives. We don't really want to take that approach. We want to, you know, go and talk with people, interview them, see what they're doing, really understand what they need. And that's actually what we've been doing a lot of for the past year, especially this summer. Doing lots and lots of farmer interviews, and previous to COVID, we were doing farm visits and saying, what is it you need and what can we design to help you with your transportation? The idea is we want it to be a collaborative system, but also with decentralized control. And by that, I mean that you don't have one entity or one person controlling the whole system. So that's good. It meets the needs of the farmers who are typically very independent and they value their autonomy and they don't want a central organization telling them what to do. But it makes it challenging to design a system that meets everyone's needs. So potential solutions that we're looking at right now from our preliminary research. So one thing we're looking at is leveraging empty backhauls. So what does that mean? So an empty backhaul, very simply, so suppose that you are a company and you want to send a truck with some product to Houston. So you send the truck with its product to Houston, the truck drops off that product, and then it's empty, but it needs to return to DFW. So it makes that whole return trip empty, okay? And so that's not very efficient. There's all that time and fuel that's being used to move nothing, an empty truck. But if you can leverage that and say, hey, empty truck, would you be willing to haul some product from Eastern Texas back to DFW to consumers who want product that is produced there, then that can be a win-win situation for the farmer that's sending the food, because you might be able to get cheaper transportation, and it's good for the person, you know, the organization with the truck, because they're not wasting that trip. Another thing that we're looking at this pretty heavily, is creating a crowd shipping platform. And so what I mean by that is creating some kind of essentially like Uber Freight or DoorDash, some kind of crowd supported logistics system for small scale farmers, so that they can access you know, anybody who has an empty truck or empty space that would be willing to haul food, that they could do that. So there's a lot of challenges associated with that concept, and we're looking into that right now, but just looking to say, hey, if we could design something for you and give this a try, would that be beneficial? And we think perhaps it could be. Some other things we're looking at, so peri-urban crosstalks and food hubs. What does that mean? So that means some small drop-off and aggregation centers outside of an urban area, so that a farmer making deliveries doesn't have to go into the center of Dallas or Houston or Austin, which is time-consuming and full of traffic. So they make that drop off, and then someone else comes and picks it up and brings it into the city. And so that could be the crowd shipping piece. Another thing we're looking at is urban micro storage, and so potentially some lockers for food to be dropped off, so that deliveries don't have to be made to consumers' households. You don't have to worry about people being home and that sort of thing. And so of course Amazon has done that, and so we're looking at that possibility for farmers as well. And then more broadly looking at farmer and rancher collaborative transportation and storage. So having farmers and ranchers work with one another to share a vehicle, to share trips, perhaps to share some storage. And some farmers and ranchers are doing that right now, but it's not necessarily easy. So why not? Well, some of the major challenges, among others, is that coordination is complex and costly. So all of these ideas that I mentioned above are not easy to implement and not easy to control. And that's something that we're trying to figure out, is how could we do that in a cost-effective way? Because to be frank with you, these farmers, they're not like large organizations. They don't have loads and loads of money to spend on third-party logistics, on implementing systems. They don't have that money. So how can we do something that is not going to cost an arm and a leg and require lots of IT support that is not going to be there after this project is over? Distances are often large, and that's a challenge that's very somewhat specific to Texas, because Texas is huge. And so moving products, say from the Rio Grande Valley up to San Antonio, up to Austin, that is not an easy thing to do. And even with a good system involved, we still got those distances to deal with. So coordination can be tough for that very reason. And then I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is issues of trust and autonomy. So you can imagine, sending your perishable product, if you're a farmer, with an anonymous delivery driver, and just hoping that it gets to the customer in good shape and in a timely fashion. That trust, that has to be there, and that's not an easy thing to establish. And then autonomy, the farmers, the idea of them working together to get their product to market, sharing vehicles and so on is a great idea. But a lot of times, most of the time, frankly, they don't want to do that because they're running their own business. They want to remain independent. They have their own schedules, and they don't necessarily want to, let go of that to work with others. Okay, there's competition there as well. So lots of challenges. So how do we study these challenges? So we don't want to put a system in place, but this is a 3-year project we're working on. We don't want to put 3 years of effort into this, design a system, and everybody hates it, no one adopts it. That's absolutely what we don't want to do. So how do we test whether such systems, such ideas are going to work if we can overcome these challenges? Well, what we're looking at is using agent-based modeling to study these systems and to simulate them before we actually test them in the field. And so what is agent-based modeling? Well, here's the definition. It's a computational modeling methodology where a phenomenon is modeled in terms of agents and their interactions. So what does that mean? Well, computational modeling methodology, really all that means in a nutshell is it's a computer simulation. And the way I often describe agent-based modeling to audiences is that it's like The Sims, okay? It's like SimCity. It's really not like that. It's not a game, but it's kind of like that, where you have a number of autonomous agents and you program them with objectives and skills and abilities and the ability to interact with one another in their environment. And then you set them free and you see what happens, okay? In terms of agents, what do I mean? Well, with this particular project, looking at regional food supply chains, an agent might be a farmer or a rancher. So this would be a little computerized, it'd be a computer program, essentially. So representing farmers and ranchers using a computer program, it's called an agent. You could represent the distributors, transportation providers. You could even represent the buyers. So that could be institutions, retailers, or even end consumers. And so representing them all together in a computer simulation as an artificial social system. And so connecting them. So how do we do that? Well, we talk to the real life actors, okay? So we interview them, we survey them, we observe them, we learn about their behaviors and their preferences and what they do. And then we take that knowledge and we translate it to logical statements and mathematical statements, and we plug that into our computer program. And so we create these agents that represent people, sometimes organizations. And then, like I said, we maybe try a scenario and say, okay, what if we set up this type of crowd shipping system? And this would allow you to get your product to market. And then we run the simulation over time and see what happens. Does it work? Does it fail? Does it do something we never expected? And so that allows us to test out our ideas and our concepts on a virtual social system or a virtual supply network before implementing anything. So this type of modeling is really useful for testing these designs on systems where you've got a bunch of autonomous agents, so nobody's controlling the farmer centrally, right? They're all independent, that are socially connected. And that's a huge aspect of this that I think I haven't touched on, is that the farmers all know one another, and they are loosely connected, but they are socially connected. And so how do we leverage that? Okay. And so my last slide here, so it's just kind of it's a little bit small there, but I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of the whole project. Where does this agent-based modeling fit into everything else I told you? So kind of starting from the top left there in that figure, my students and I have been looking at existing apps, existing transportation systems, because there are startups out there that are trying to help farmers move product to urban demand centers. One of the big issues with these startups is often that they want to take their cut, no surprise, and often farmers don't want to pay the fees, also no surprise. But we're looking at what's already been done, what's out there, and what are the good ideas out there that we can borrow from, what are the failures that we can learn from. And we're converting that into, okay, for Texas, what does that mean for us? Do we want a crowd shipping system where we're relying on an autonomous population of people that can provide transportation to move food into cities? Does that make sense? Do we want to scale it down so the only transportation providers are people that the farmers know and trust within their community? So we're looking at that kind of scaling. Then, and this is where this is something we're starting to do now, is use knowledge that we've collected from the field to start mocking up a design for an app or some kind of tool. We think it's probably going to be an app to connect farmers to one another, to connect farmers to transportation providers. We're looking at piloting that with several farmers that are on our project, as well as some small scale distributors out of Central Texas, out of Austin, that are trying to do this kind of thing, but don't have the platform for it. And then once we have some ideas for design, we started building an agent-based model and plug those concepts into our agent-based model, test them out, see what we learn, and then feed back that knowledge to iteratively improve our design. And so hopefully with some iterations, and of course, showing this to our farmer partners on the project to get their feedback, at the end of the day, end up with a system that can help farmers to move their product to consumers who want it in cities in a convenient way, so that people are able to get food, like I said, in a convenient way, not necessarily going to farmers markets. Some people enjoy that, but it's not necessarily an easy thing for everyone to do. Maybe to get their food delivered at home, get their food at the grocery store, and get it locally produced. So anyway, so in a nutshell, that's this particular research project that we're working on to get regional food transported to the people that want to consume it.
Thank you, Caroline. This is a very fascinating discussion, presentation of your research. I now want to turn it over to the audience to see if anybody has any questions. If you do, please type it in the chat window so that we can see it and we can communicate it with Caroline. So while people are thinking about questions of their own, let me ask a couple of questions that I've been thinking about while you were giving this presentation. I think one thing you mentioned in your talk was this business of trust, right? So there's a lot of actors in this entire network that you're putting together, or you're planning to put together, and there has to be a significant amount of trust for this whole thing to run, right? Mm. How do you think that is going to be modeled in your simulation system? Is it going to be easy to plan it ahead of time and see whether it's going to work or not, or do you have to really do a field deployment to really figure out whether this whole thing is going to be successful or not?
Yeah, so that's a really good question about trust, because that's one of the biggest issues. You know, I think that when we think about logistics systems for regional food systems, and the challenge is often it's in terms of farmers will immediately talk about cost, and they will talk about access to, you know, companies that are willing to provide transportation and all these kind of nuts and bolts, and trust doesn't come up until you really talked about it for a while with them, but that's really, it's a huge issue. So whether we can study that just using the modeling. So I think it's, you know, again, an iterative process of kind of trying some things, talking to key stakeholders and actors in the system and showing them our concept and getting feedback. The good thing about farmers, they're usually pretty honest. They're usually pretty willing to share their opinion very bluntly. So that's good. The people that we're working with are pretty open to trying some things. So it's kind of an iterative process of trying something, modeling it up and saying, you know, okay, here's what we see in the model. Let's give this a try on a very small scale and then see how it works. And so depending on, so what we learned from the real life pilot, that information gets fed back into the model to make the model more valid is how we call it. So improving the quality, predictive quality of the model comes from what we see in the real life system, and then you know, that kind of cycles around. Modeling trust is not something new. Certainly this is not the first time trust has been modeled. It's something that's very, very widely studied, especially among people that use agent-based modeling. And so there's a variety of models of trust out there. A lot of it has to do with, you know, developing relationships over time, certainly. But with a crowd shipping app, for example, so if you imagine yourself using Lyft or Uber, and you call a driver, you order a driver, and you don't know who that driver is. It's completely anonymous. And so how do you know if you can trust that driver, that you trust that they're going to show up and that they're actually going to take you where you want to go in a timely and safe fashion? Well, it's not because you know them and you've developed a relationship with them. It's because of, well, typically you trust the platform, you trust the ratings, right? And so that's something that we're looking at as we're developing concepts for this system, is where do ratings play a role? Because if it's a completely anonymous system, you have to have ratings. I mean, you have to have feedback from users, absolutely. If it's not a fully anonymous system, though, that gets a little bit tricky, because then, you know, a rating system, well, you're rating your community members, potentially you're rating your friends and neighbors and people that you've worked with, you know, other farmers in your community. So how honest are you going to be? How does that play into your relationships with them down the road? So I guess I don't really have a complete answer for how we're going to handle that, but it's something that's a huge focus of our research, is how do we model trust, and how can that issue, the issue of trust, be overcome when we actually implement this kind of system.
Okay. Yeah, fascinating. I'm sure that there'll be a lot of interesting research challenges before you can, you know, convert this into a practical system. So moving along, we've got a few questions from the audience. So let me see. The first one that I can see here is there going to be a difference in the way that meats and produce will be transported in your research project? And I'm just trying to interpret what this question might mean. It might mean difference from the more traditional way in which meat and produce is transported, or I guess that's what the questioner means.
It could mean also, and the reason I think about this is because this has come up in the research. It could also mean in the regional system, is there a difference between the way that meats are going to be handled versus fresh produce? I think that's probably what the audience member intends. I'm not sure. I'll answer it in that way, because that's something that we've been looking at recently. So that's huge. There's a huge difference, yes. So with produce, there's the issue of perishability, certainly. So you typically have to move things really quickly, or you have to have refrigeration and transport and in storage, certainly, especially in Texas summer. So there's that aspect of it, but generally it's sort of straightforward. You know, you have the fresh product, farmer packages it up, may palletize it, somehow gets it on some kind of vehicle, either the farmer's own vehicle or somebody else's, and then it moves to a store, and then, you know, it's received and then becomes available for consumers. Meat undergoes processing, obviously. So the farmer's got live animals, all right, and so the live animals have to be processed into meat that the consumer wants to buy, and so there's all these other steps. And actually that brings up a huge challenge that I didn't mention for regional food supply systems, and that's the processing for meats. And so if I'm a livestock farmer, if I'm a rancher, small scale rancher or poultry producer, for example, and I want to get my food processed and I want to be able to sell it, even just within the state of Texas, if I want to be able to sell it to consumers, I have to have it processed, and by processed I mean the animal has to be slaughtered at a certified processor. Okay, and so there's really not that many of them out there, and there's certainly very few that are willing to work with very small scale animal producers. So that's really, first of all, there's just not that many. And secondly, the distances between the meat producers and these processing facilities is often huge. Scheduling is often difficult. So the farmer's got to go and drop off the animal, and then they wait maybe a week or so, and then they've got to drive back to wherever that processor is and pick it up. Typically the meat's frozen, so you've got to make sure that you quickly get it back to your storage facility or back to your farm in good condition, safely still frozen. So that's a huge additional effort in the regional food supply system for meat producers. So this is a big challenge for them. We started the project mainly by talking to fresh produce farmers, and then started talking to ranchers and poultry producers, and discovered, wow, this is a huge issue. So then the question is there going to be a difference in the way that we handle that? So I would say yes, necessarily there is. One thing we've looked at is the possibility of having some longer term storage of the meat once it's processed at the processor, so the farmer isn't rushing back to get the meat necessarily, that if they don't have storage capacity on their farm or their ranch, that they can leverage off-site storage capacity. So yeah, I would say I hope that that's what you intended with your question, but I can say absolutely meat and produce are handled very, very differently in this small scale supply chain. They have different challenges.
Okay, thank you, Caroline. Next question. So what led you to investigate this problem? I mean, I know that you mentioned all the shortcomings of the larger supply chains, the nationwide supply chains, but there may have been some personal experience or some personal reason why you wanted to investigate this issue. And,
yeah, that's a good question. So I actually got interested in this area. It was probably, gosh, it's 2020 now, so this was more than 10 years ago. So before I went back and got my PhD. And so it kind of started, I started reading a little. I had no idea about food supply chains really at all. I'd been to the farmer's market a couple of times and tried my hand at growing some items, not very successfully. But I got interested in food from a health aspect, from a health standpoint. I was curious about eating more healthfully, got to learn a little bit more about where meat comes from. And when you learn about where meat comes from and our conventional meat supply chain, it's for me personally, it was horrifying. It was really scary, really scary from a lot of standpoints, from a health standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, just a lot of issues. And so once I got to know more about that, that got me curious about other things. And so I just started reading more. And so it was kind of a personal thing from a health standpoint, and then also from an environmental standpoint. And then I started my PhD, and I talked with my advisor and said, hey, I'm really interested in sustainable food supply chains, resilient food supply chains. Can I work on this? And she said, sure, go for it. And so that's what I did for my PhD, and learned more and more about it, and the connection with logistics and supply chain for these smaller scale, a little bit more sustainable, potentially more sustainable chains. And that's, I just continued on with that. I've had a lot of good opportunities to dig into that research in Iowa as well as here in Texas, and that's, here I am now.
Okay, so the next question, I'm going to try and interpret it the best I can. Let me just read it out. So what kind of plan is there for regionalized, i.e. oranges or bananas, food that is in large demand in a rather far location from the rural small farm? So
yeah, so that's a great question, because that gets into the issue of seasonality, which is not one of the challenges I mentioned with respect to regionalized food supply systems. We have seasons and we have different climates. And so, yeah, if you're not getting food shipped in from Mexico, from Central America, from, tropical climates, then you miss out on some of those foods like bananas, avocados, all those good foods that we enjoy. So one thing I will say, Texas is particularly challenging with respect to regional food supply chains because of the distances that we're dealing with, because Texas is such a large state and things are so spread out. But on the positive side, we have a lot of climates, okay, which is great. In the south of Texas, we're able to, in the Rio Grande Valley, we're able to grow some amazing tropical foods. My research team and I went down there last spring, and not this past spring, but the spring before, and just were blown away by the cool things that they're able to grow down there. Certainly you probably know Texas grapefruits. So that's a huge production down there, but they can grow all kinds of other things. And not only can they grow things that we cannot grow in Central Texas or up here in North Texas, but they can grow them at different times. And so one of the things that's really interesting to me that I want to investigate in this project is how we can leverage that. Because in the south of Texas, they're growing these foods, in early spring, but then by about May and June, it's so hot down there, they're done. They're not growing anything anymore. But that's about the time that, Central Texas, East Texas, even North Texas, we're able to start, producing food. And so we're still dealing with seasonality, but you can kind of stretch it out within the state because we have such a large state and such diverse climates. So that's, so again, I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question, telling you what the plan is, but I think that's one of the advantages of Texas that we can leverage to be able to kind of get around that seasonality aspect. So it's not like, in more northern climates where it's like, okay, it's winter, what are we going to eat? Well, sweet potatoes from storage and apples from storage, and you're very limited potentially in the winter. Down here, we basically have growing season throughout the entire year if you look at across the entire state, and a wide variety of items. So that's something we're thinking about.
Okay, all right. So the next question, I guess we're going back to trust again. I'm not sure whether this is a technology question or it's a policy question or a strategy question. So how do farmers' unions impact relationships and trust among farmers?
So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by farmers' unions. I can speak a little bit to farmer cooperatives. So for example, in the Rio Grande Valley, there is let's see, what are they called? The Young Texas, I forget what the acronym is, but it's the Young Texas Farmers Coalition or Cooperative. So it's a group of, as it sounds like, young Texas farmers that are small scale growers that are working together. And I would say that, yeah, that's one of the best ways to develop trust among farmers. There's another example from Central Texas. So they are in They're outside of San Antonio, and so they're a formal cooperative. So it's a group of farmers. It's a dozen of them, small scale to medium scale, and they're working together. And when you have that cooperative, so not only do they have personal relationships that they developed over time, the nice thing about having I'm not sure about a union per se, but having a formal cooperative arrangement governing that collaboration is that it takes a little bit of pressure off of relying on trust, because you've got you've got documents and rules and a plan essentially that's formally regulating what you can and cannot do and what the penalties are if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So I think that the idea of a union or cooperative, that's something that I have seen in Texas as being can be very, very successful. There's been some that have failed as well, and that's something that we're looking at is why did they fail? What were the reasons for the failures of these cooperatives? But when they work, it's great because yeah, you still have that trust aspect, but you've got some formal framework, some formal structure that takes a little bit of that away because you're not strictly relying on relationships anymore.
Okay. So I think I have a follow-up question to one of the earlier ones. I mean, to me, it appears like you kind of go back to the way things were done before. So you're kind of going decentralized. You're involving local transporters, smaller players, I guess, in this game. So have you tried learning from how farming was done in the past, or maybe looking at other countries where maybe the centralized systems are less developed to see how they do things and whether you can learn techniques from those models? Or yeah, so I mean, is my hypothesis correct that in some sense we are trying to do farming as it should be done or as it used to be done before?
Yes, yeah. So the answer to that is yes, absolutely. We're looking to so in the U.S. Before World War II, this is kind of how farming was done. And if you look at how people were employed in the U.S. Before World War II, I cannot remember the statistic, but most people were farmers. Most people, I mean, that was how people earned a living, or they were connected somehow with farming. And so it was a lot of smaller scale farms. It was a lot more diversified. So for example, Iowa, which now we look at Iowa and it's principally corn and soybeans. Back in the day, and it wasn't that long ago, I mean, 60, 70 years ago, it was completely diversified. It wasn't corn and soybeans. I mean, apples were a huge crop for Iowa, for example, tomatoes, peas, carrots, all of that. But that's gone pretty much. That's almost all gone. It's all corn and soybeans now and some hog farms. And so do we want to go back to that way of producing? And so, I think that there are good things to be learned from the past and also from other countries, as you mentioned, that are doing small scale farming. I think there are certainly things to be learned from that. I think that there are, well, one challenge that comes to my mind, because I have thought a lot about this actually, is that going back to that way of producing and distributing food is not just a matter of getting food from small farms to cities. There's other issues. There's the issue, especially in North Texas, of getting more people willing to farm, willing to take that risk because it is risky. Willing to, find a way to purchase land because it's expensive and that's hard to do. So finding people willing to produce. And then the next step, something that was prevalent years ago and is no longer, is processing. So there's fresh produce, certainly, and that's what we think of when we think of local farmers markets, but a big portion of food that's fresh, produced, fruits and vegetables, is processed somehow, right? It's going to be canned or frozen or processed for longer term storage. And that's another way you can get away from the issue of seasonality. The issue is that there used to be all these processors throughout the country, smallish scale processors, I mean, all over that were serving all of these diversified farms, and those are gone. So if you look throughout Iowa, for example, let's say I wanted to produce several acres of carrots, well, who would I sell them to? Who is there to process them for me in the Midwest? Same thing down here in Texas is processors. I mentioned meat processors. There's very, very few. And for a small scale producer to work with the processors that exist can be very challenging because those processors are used to working with huge operations. So looking back at how things were, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned from that. And I think actually, one of the things I think from my research is that we can borrow good ideas from existing systems. Like I said, looking at logistics best practices from companies like companies that are doing it really well, not necessarily even in food, but companies like Walmart, for example. You might not think of them in the same, or speak of them in the same breath as speaking of regional food supply chains, but looking at what they do well and borrowing from that and saying, okay, what can we add on to these older ideas about small scale food production to make it more efficient? So that's kind of some of my thoughts on that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of more questions from the audience. So how are the potential solutions designed to make the regionalized system as an independent system less fragile than the current centralized system?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So conceptually, the idea is that if you have, if you have one large scale beef producer versus many small scale beef producers that are spread out of different areas throughout a region, that is more resilient because one thing, if you take down the large scale centralized producer if something happens, there's illness, for example, or somehow that producer is put out of commission, then the whole meat supply fails. Versus having multiple small scale producers spread out all over the place. If one experiences some kind of problem that shuts them down, it's okay because we have lots of others. Another example, not a COVID example, but is like drought. If there's drought in the Central Valley in California, which we have seen this happen, and we're all throughout the U.S. relying on Central California for our to provide our fruits and vegetables, and they're experiencing drought, then that means there's going to be less food produced and it's going to be more expensive. Versus if we have that spread out so that you have a number of smaller producers that are closer to you, not necessarily really local, but regional. That's what I think anyway. That you don't necessarily have that problem, because if there's drought being experienced in one part of a region, then another part of that region may not be. So that's kind of the concept. So more specifically, your question, how are the potential solutions designed to make regionalized system less fragile? So once you have that regionalized system, like I said, in concept, it should be less fragile and more resilient than a very heavily centralized system, because you don't have these choke points that could fail and cause the whole system to fail as a result. But keep somehow connecting them, connecting small scale farmers to consumers and making sure that those connections can't be disrupted. And so that gets back to what I said about creating a system, a transportation system that is decentralized as well. So you've got the production that's decentralized, but also some kind of collaborative transportation system and logistics system that is not centrally controlled by one central agency. So we're not relying on Uber for moving all of our food, okay? So that's the idea, is if you not only decentralize the production, but you also decentralize the control of the distribution, that you create more resilience there as well. There's issues with that, there's challenges with that, but that's the concept.
Great. We still have a few more questions coming in from the audience. So I guess this is a kind of a general question. It's up to you to decide how you want to answer it. Do you recommend engineering students to go into research?
Oh yeah, of course. Of course, I recommend engineering students go into research. So walk that back a little bit. So whether you want to go into research, I think it's a really great idea, if you have some interest in research, to give it a try. And I think we have a number of really excellent opportunities in the College of Engineering at UTA for undergraduates to get involved in research. Absolutely. I've worked with multiple undergraduate students since I've come to UTA. I'm working with a really good one right now from industrial engineering. And I've worked with some at Iowa State. I have quite a bit of experience with that, and I will tell you that it's great for students to give it a try. I've worked with some students that get into research and they love it, and they decide, I want to go on to graduate school, and that's great. I've had some students, very good students, have tried out research and they decided it was not for them. You know, research is very open-ended and very it doesn't appeal to everybody, but it gives you the chance to give it a try and see if you like it, and you can, you know, you might even potentially try with multiple faculty to try different research avenues. So yes, definitely.
Great, thank you, Carolyn. So I know that the audience probably have lots of other questions, and this could go on and on for a while, but we of course have other things to do. I'm sure Dr. Krejci has other things to do. We really have to stop at this point, and those who felt that they had a few questions that they want to still get answered, you know how to reach her. Please feel free to send her an email, and I'm sure she'll be happy to oblige. Let's all join and thank Dr. Krejci for an amazing presentation, followed by a very spirited question answering session. I'm sure all of us learned a lot, me included. So with this, I'm going to wrap up the session. I just want to remind everybody that we're going to have this research sessions or equivalent sessions every Fridays from 12 to 1, and please come for the next ones. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.